It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me, and thank you for, and congratulations actually on a great meeting so far. So I'm a neurologist, and I've turned into a drug developer over the last few years. And so we generate a lot of big data, and we analyze a lot of big data to make decisions. And I'm hoping to actually turn most of you into neuroscientists here by the end of my talk, because we desperately need new approaches to data analysis in brain healthcare. So there's been a lot of interesting things happening in brain healthcare, some relatively sinister things that we may not appreciate, actually. For the last 20,000 years or so, there's only been about 100 or 200 million people on this planet. It's just in the last 200 years that we've actually gone from those few hundred million to 7 billion, actually. And so we really changed the dynamics of natural selection and the rules of nature. And this has put a lot of stress on our own biology, actually. So that genes, typically that might have been adaptive for, let's say, getting us through a drought, actually now may cause hypertension because we don't really have droughts anymore. Or if there's a famine, if you were obese, you were the last person to go. So that was an adaptive trait. But there's no more famines, so now that's actually a health hazard. So likewise, actually, most of us weren't meant to live till 90 or 100 years old with our brains intact, with full cognitive functions and so on. And so what's happening is that as this population is rising so quickly, our genes really haven't had a time to adapt to our environment. And the aging is actually the biggest risk factor for neurodegenerative disease. So we're seeing a skyrocket of neurodegenerative diseases right now, and Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. In fact, there's about 5.5 million people right now in the United States that have Alzheimer's disease. Most of these are over the age of 65, about 5.2 million. That's actually 1 out of 8 people over the age of 65 that have Alzheimer's disease. If you go worldwide, it's actually, if you're over 85, it's 1 out of 2 people. And guess what? That's actually going to be the life expectancy not too long from now. So it's kind of a horrible statistic. And it's really being driven by this rise in population. Because back in the Stone Ages or in the Roman Ages, people died by the time they were 50 or 60. So we didn't actually see much of Alzheimer's disease because it didn't, manifest in time. But this is a real calamity right now because the rate at which these diseases are growing are just very daunting. We have no cure for them. And if we don't actually develop a cure for these diseases, Alzheimer's alone, for example, is just going to bankrupt most of the world's currencies, most of the world's economies, probably by the middle of this century. And so by 2050, if we don't have any cure for actually stopping Alzheimer's disease in its track, the annual cost just in the United States for taking care of Alzheimer's disease is going to be about $1.1 trillion. And the sad part is to make a drug for diseases like Alzheimer's disease and so on, it takes about 10 to 15 years now, and at a cost of about between $1 to $1.5 billion. So those are not good statistics. And in fact, the drug development for the brain is the most difficult compared to cancer or heart disease and so on. And really, it's now become the most lengthy, the most costly, and actually the least successful. So this is actually a very scary scenario that we're faced with. And I think new approaches to measurements and data analysis actually may hold some of the solution to this problem. So why are we stuck? And then how can actually big data approaches help us? So one of the biggest problems is that the brain is our most complex organ. We know less about the brain than we do about the heart or about the liver or about the endocrine system and so on. It's got 10 to the 10th neurons, 10 to the 14th connections or synapses between those neurons. You've heard about genomics earlier today. There's only about 3 times 10 to the 9th DNA base pairs. So the numbers that we're talking about as far as brain function and the elements of the brain far outweigh the genetic sciences that we're faced with today. The brains are highly individualized, they're very plastic. All of us have our own unique experiences and tolerances and lifestyles and behaviors and so on. It makes it very difficult to actually standardize measurements about brain and behavior. But the good news is there are new methodologies that are now able to actually quantify brain physiology reproducibly, and they require a lot of new different analytical approaches and new methodologies. And the same goes for understanding of the brain diseases. There's so far been very few hypotheses that have actually driven the research. It's very costly to do this research, so we haven't been able to test many different hypotheses. Most of them are actually based on genetic models of animals' disease, and those are actually represent maybe 5 to 10% of Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. Most of it's sporadic. We actually don't know what causes these diseases. And these diseases are actually very insidious and have very capricious, sort of progress, and they develop in highly variable ways that are difficult to predict. And the endpoints that we use to actually track these diseases are themselves quite noisy. The clinical scales that we use for cognition and motor function and so on. And so it makes the measurement of disease progression or any therapeutic that you might develop to make a difference in that disease very challenging. But the good news is there are reams of data now emerging from these data-rich trials that are longitudinal efforts to actually understand Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. And I'll mention a couple of these, namely the NIH ADNI study and the Michael J. Fox Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative. Now these initiatives, actually, these studies have a lot of different types of biomarkers. So again, it gives you a great opportunity to use data analytical approaches to come up with new relationships and new discoveries. So, but both of these efforts really involve measurements and data. So it's very difficult to actually come up with what to measure about the brain. What is your brain number? And we don't have such a number like we do our cholesterol number, our blood pressure number, our glucose number. It's actually a very provocative concept, because if we had that, it makes a huge difference in disease management. If you think about heart disease now, we actually don't call it heart disease anymore. We call it hypertension or hypercholesterolemia or arrhythmia. We break it down into subsets based on certain biomarkers that we can measure about those diseases. In fact, we even treat the biomarker. We treat somebody's blood pressure or their cholesterol number way before they have the disease. So we're not actually treating the disease, but we're warding off the disease by treating that biomarker. Well, we don't have that for the nervous system. And we can't access the brain. We can't take a chunk out and easily do molecular analysis on it. So that makes it very challenging. And this really impacts patient diagnosis, management, healthcare in general, and particularly drug development for these diseases. So what do we measure? There's so many things about the brain. Is it your IQ, your cognition, your emotional well-being, sleep, mood? Very challenging. Same thing with disease. We know that some diseases are genetically caused, but again, as I mentioned, they're a very small fraction that we know that are familial forms of these diseases. Most are sporadic. So we know that there's some genes that are susceptibility genes that make you more likely to have these diseases. But there's also modifier genes, things that may actually ward off the disease for some time. And those are hard to predict. We don't know enough from the genomics data yet what those genes are. We also know that there's a big environmental play, especially for cardiovascular disease and diabetes and so on. We're not sure what those environmental factors are completely for neurological diseases. Clearly, your peripheral disease burden influences that, life events. But also the disease processes themselves are pretty sneaky. In fact, Alzheimer's disease probably begins about 10 to 15 years before people show any symptoms. I mean, it's kind of scary. Many of us in this room may actually have the disease blooming without us even knowing about it. And there's a lot of resiliency in the brain. There's ways to sort of fight off the symptoms till it's too late, actually. In fact, for Parkinson's disease, by the time you actually have the motor symptoms, the area of your brain that's affected has lost about 80% of its neurons already. And it may be too late, actually, at that point to start treating the disease. So again, we need earlier measures and biomarkers to tell us, when are these processes beginning? When can we intervene? And without that, it's going to be very difficult. The good news is there are lots of ways to measure things about the brain. For years, we've used simple clinical tools like clinical histories, one's cognition, their ability to sense things, move, balance, things like that. But there's lots of new research technologies that have emerged over the last 20, 30 years that now offer very objective measurements of the physiology of the nervous system. These were typically research tools that are now being transformed into sort of diagnostic tools. But that effort is actually taking a lot more experimentation that basically establishes an individual's normative baseline, normative population data, classifiers for decision making. Do you have disease or do you not? Is the drug working? Is it not? Those are, to get to that level with these technologies, it actually takes a lot more experimentation and a lot more data. And the good thing is that data is emerging. In fact, it's available for free now. And I'll show you a couple of different initiatives that are producing that data. But people in this audience can actually have this data right away and actually help this cause by coming up with new ways to look at disease progression and brain function. So one such effort is this human Connectome project. This is a very audacious project that actually tries to, it's sort of like the Manhattan Project of brain connections. It's an NIH-sponsored project, and they're trying to, for the first time, establish the wiring diagram and the functional connections between circuits in the normal brain. And this effort actually uses some state-of-the-art imaging technology, the current best scanners, as well as a new future generation of MRI scanners that are being developed as part of this project, EEG and magnetoencephalography. And all these tools are actually going to evaluate brain function during a resting state, while you're doing simple tasks like tapping a finger, or listening to a tone, or looking at some cognitive visual data. And all the subjects in this study will actually have their genotypes evaluated. There's hundreds of twins in the study, as well as non-twin siblings. So people will be able to compare the impact that genetics makes versus the environment makes. This will all be open source. It'll be about 1 petabyte of data in the next couple of years, freely available to anybody to come in and try to do different relationships and make new connections and new biomarkers, actually. Likewise, there's major efforts going on in doing similar sort of approaches for disease progression. The Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, as well as the Parkinson's Progression Marker Initiative are two such examples. These are large, population data sets that are tracking patients from early disease into late disease. But again, they're looking at, imaging, movement, cognition, CSF biomarkers, fluid biomarkers. And all of this is actually available. It's all open source. These are really setting a new benchmark for multi-site, coordinated studies where data is made available freely to the public. A lot of this data is actually curated, so it comes in as sort of this hub and spoke model where people bring it in, they make sure it's not dirty data, it's good, and then they release it to investigators and then to the public. So any of you can actually be an instant neuroscientist and actually help make connections in this area. A lot of the neuroscientists that are using this data are actually already working on their biases and their hypotheses and so on. I actually think it'll be a great boost to the field if you actually bring in people from other fields that are sort of agnostic to particular hypotheses and biases and start to make new connections with this data. This is also leading to sort of new database frameworks. The Global Alzheimer's Association Interactive Network actually is going to coordinate the curating of a lot of this data from many different trials, like ADNI, like Parkinson's, or like the Connectome project. And this will be a vast repository of data, as well as the analytical tools and the computational power that you need to actually do something with this data. And again, the goal is to really transform the way we approach these diseases, to really let all the data out and let as many people work on it as possible to help make a difference. And this is research data collected in the laboratory. And it's not just imaging data. Again, I stress it's molecular data, it's genomic data, it's functional data, and there will be new connections that'll come out of this. We ourselves are actually looking at some of this data and trying to come up with new relationships. This is a partnership we have with GNS Healthcare in looking at a large longitudinal database of Parkinson's patients, where we actually have imaging data, functional data, and we're going to use their machine learning approaches to come up with new relationships as far as what initial factors when a person presents actually predict at the rate at which they'll decline. This could actually help us choose the right patients for the right for clinical trials, where things change in time for you to see a drug effect. And we are hoping to actually get brand new relationships that haven't been previously appreciated out of this effort. But there's another source of data that's also emerging. And this is what we've been talking about, the quantified self, all the fitness data, all the sensors that are out there. We've really changed as a species. We actually interact with our computers and our cell phones more than we do with each other, certainly more than we do with doctors. So why can't those instruments actually be the measures of our behavior? Because our interaction with them is actually cognition and behavior. And so a lot of people are starting to think about this and actually turn it around. And maybe the devices to understand the brain and develop new brain biomarkers are really right under our noses. Yes, there are new sensors and new approaches that can monitor all kinds of physiology and link it up with your healthcare records potentially. A lot of this is just being used for fitness sake, but it could be turned into very valuable neurological data. EEGs are actually emerging. Again, there's been a renaissance in this area where brain waves can actually be measured very easily now due to advancements in methodology and data analysis. One company that we're working with, advanced brain monitoring, shown there on the right, has actually got a very nice real-time neurophysiology setup where with mobile EEGs they can measure 8 to 10 hours of data just while you're doing your daily activities, and actually watch it real time. There's a lot of data here. Maybe there's too much data, but a lot of this actually may be valuable. So if we actually connect this data with clinicians and scientists that know how to apply it and how to make sense out of it, there could be a lot of value in this. One example of this is shown in the computer and iPhone thing there in the middle of the screen. This is computer-based brain training programs like Lumosity. I don't know if many of you use these sort of programs, but these are freely available on the internet or on your mobile device. And these actually represent some of the largest data sets, believe it or not, for cognitive performance. So Lumosity in particular has over 25 million users that are geographically and demographically diverse. They have over 450 million cognitive performance endpoints. This is a lot of data to help us understand relationships between cognitive performance and lifestyle. Because on their websites, they also ask demographics of where you live, simple surveys about your lifestyles, how much do you drink, how many hours do you sleep at night, and so on. And again, while it might seem that this is sort of unstructured data that's kind of out there, it's actually quite powerful. There's an experiment that they did recently that actually shows this. They actually took certain questions from their from the people that actually use this stuff, and they actually tried to match it to their cognitive performance on the test. So for example, there's 3 tests that they looked at: the speed match test, the memory matrix, and this raindrops test, which actually does mathematical efforts. And they matched it with lifestyle questions, like how much do you drink? So if you see on the top panel there, what it's actually showing you is that's with sleep, and the bottom panel is with how many drinks you have per day. So if you sleep about 7 hours a day, that's when you're maximally performing on all these tests. If you sleep less than that, you're doing worse. If you sleep more than that, you're actually doing worse. And the number of drinks on the bottom, if you have about 1 or 2 drinks per day, you actually do better than having no drinks. But if you drink too much, it's also bad. And this actually fits with the data that we've had from very formalized studies on these type of subjects. But the remarkable thing for me is these are enormous amounts of data. Each one of these, for the raindrops test, it was 145,000 data points that they're looking at, or 750,000 users that you just got for free by people clicking on the. So this is an enormously powerful way to actually make some new breakthroughs and develop new biomarkers for neuroscience. Also for disease states, a lot of the things that we try to measure in the hospital or in the clinic can actually be done on simple devices, because again, it's about cognition and behavior and motion and so on. Just the way you handle your device, for example, there's so much information in there with the accelerometers, the way you pinch and zoom in now with your devices. These are all motor tasks that actually can be quantified. Simple games that allow you to actually move a particular cursor into an area. While all that's going on, there's so many measurements being made about the tremor of your hands, the tone, the balance, your eye contact with the phone. Again, if you have a seasoned neurologist, they could actually probably turn this into a very clever exam that will be just as valuable as bringing a patient into the hospital. But again, we can use this over and over, get a lot more data points as far as someone's baseline, and do this remotely. This kind of stuff, I think, is going to be transformative, actually, for neurology, because there's so many devices out there that require your movement, your behavior, and your cognition, and really they're testing your nervous system all the time. So why don't we capture that data and turn it around and make it into sort of an electronic health record for the nervous system? And there's so many opportunities now with things like virtual reality, the Microsoft Kinect. I mean, it makes an avatar of you, and it actually monitors your movement. If you couple that with a simple neurological set of maneuvers that we typically do in the clinic, you have a neurological exam from home. In fact, this could be a running diary of your neuro performance that's very cheap. It's available. Moreover, it's gaming. This whole gamification engages subjects more and actually makes them want to participate in their own healthcare. So these sort of data sets, I think, are incredibly valuable, and I think it's people like those of you in this audience that are really going to take this to the next level and make it into meaningful data. I know we're talking about fun and games here, but this is really serious stuff. We're up against a major problem. This whole dement of man that I'm talking about, this is us. This is the next 35 years. This is most of the people in this audience. And I think the biomarkers that we develop from this can really help us develop drugs for this, but maybe even develop therapies. Because one last thing I'd just like to leave you with is that not everybody dements. In fact, most people aren't going to dement. And there are people that age successfully and that have lived, long cognitive lives. This is Jean Clement, who's the longest lived person ever. She lived till 122. She smoked for 100 years. She drank every day of her life. She ate a lot of chocolate. And her genetics actually wouldn't tell you that she was somehow, but what was it about her? What were her lifestyle things? We couldn't monitor that in the last century, but we can now. We actually have now, everybody's going to be digitized in this age, and maybe we'll come up with actually new observations and behaviors and ways of living that'll actually help us ward off these diseases. So again, I challenge you all to join this fight, become neuroscientists, help us take this data and develop new solutions. So thank you.